Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man. Join us on benpakulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
Move your body. Miss Katy Bowman joins me today and tells you why it's absolutely imperative that not only are you exercising, but you are incorporating more day-to-day movement. These conveniences of the modern world are taking away the necessary movements of the human body. There's things that we don't do anymore that are causing injury, that are actually leading to disease, immobility, arthritis, and many other things. I love this conversation. Katy is bringing us back to our roots, and you guys know I'm a granola cruncher at heart. So something as simple as improving the mobility of your feet, trying to squat more, trying to reach more, trying to bend more, all these things are going to contribute to your happiness, your health, and longevity. So definitely check out Katy's routine and how exactly she recommends you incorporate this into your day-to-day routine. Enjoy the podcast. And as always, share, leave me a review. Take care. Hey guys, I interrupt this podcast to bring you a special note from ATP Labs. You guys know I've aligned with ATP Labs because ATP Labs is a company that cares about what goes into their products as much as I care about what goes into my body. I've become neurotic since I've been exposed to what exactly goes into our food supply, what exactly ends up in our supplements, and you guys should be too, because you're concerned with your progress. You're obviously intelligent people who want to get the most of your time, of your effort. So I highly suggest you check out atplab.com and enjoy the episode. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Today we have an awesome guest, as always. This is going to be a little bit outside the box, and I think this is probably the most exciting guest that I've had in a while personally, because it's definitely a place that touches home for me. As we evolve, as we get busy, as we develop our businesses, we all get lazy, ultimately. We all find ways to increase our convenience and decrease our movement. Katy Bowman, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you are the one who's leading the conversation around enhancing movement and getting back to the natural environment that we've evolved to live in. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I've been in, the movement fitness industry for 20 years, maybe a little bit more. And I just found that, the message is still evolving beyond maybe some of the nuts and bolts of training principles as I got older and left, what I was doing in college as an athlete and started having kids. I was like, I feel like I can't maintain the capacity of movement that I was accustomed to, that I enjoyed, that made me feel the best. So I just started to look at, well, what is movement? I only knew about this thing called exercise. Mm-hmm. I hadn't really been given I would say, even though I studied in kinesiology departments, it was still always about exercise, even though it was human movement. So I just started to think, when I was still in graduate school, a little bit like, well, what is movement exactly then? And where does it come from? You know what I mean? Like, it just seemed strange that we needed to exercise, given that all the humans really before us had never had to exercise. So I just started to think of what was natural movement? How do humans move naturally? Meaning, if they were in a situation where they were outside most of the time and had to fend for themselves and build their own things, what would those motions be? Would we even have to exercise if we were doing that? What training principles could apply to those scenarios? And that's kind of what I've done for the last 10 years is think about movement outside of exercise and where it fits kind of into the natural world, including environments and things like that.
That's awesome. So I'll tell you what, I'm that weird guy who's like always walking with his shoes off. I own my own gym, so I'm always walking here with my shoes off and really trying to expose my body to different types of stimulus, walking in the ground. People think I'm crazy, but I really see the value in that. I see the value in maintaining the strength of my feet, in maintaining optimal pelvic function, and just being able to experience different types of terrains. And that's something you talk about a lot. What are the things you recommend to integrate this type of thought process into the busy everyday life?
Well, I think that what I do is really for the busy person, because, the busy person, the person who's got, who's working 8 to 12 hours a day, who's got a family, who has any hobbies, as the research and movement keeps ramping up, we just keep seeming to need more of it, more types of it. Like the requirements of movement are heaped upon us, but no one's taking all the responsibilities off our plate. No one's like, hey, turns out you need 4 hours of movement a day, but like your work schedule isn't as evidence-based as that. They're not gonna be like, oh, you need 3 extra hours of exercise? Okay, well, then I'll reduce that load. So I started to think, well, how can we fit movement into our day when we are still being productive in the other capacities that we serve? How can I exercise or move my body when I'm at work? How can I exercise or move my body when I'm parenting, when I'm connecting with my community or my partner? So I just started to think in terms of solutions in that way. So I think that moving more in general is something that everyone listening has probably heard that they need to do. I actually started with feet because I found that it didn't matter if I was working with an Olympian or if I was working with someone who was a complete couch potato who had never exercised a day in their life. Both of them had almost equally sedentary feet because they had both put their foot inside a shoe and had just walked around kind of on flat, hard terrain their whole entire life. So I was like, okay, well, if you went to a personal trainer and they're looking at you, they're going to be like, okay, we're going to have to work this muscle group and this muscle group. Like there's a balance that you're looking for. There's applying training principles to say you need muscle mass and therefore bone density, and and that affects the metabolic system that's happening here. So I just said, okay, well, let's start with our feet, because at a certain point for many long time exercises, like the feet and the ankles and the knee and the hip and the pelvis and the back, they start undermining your ability to continue exercising. Sure. So, there's a lot of people who are dealing with injuries who might not recognize that their injuries are related back to how they have moved. That exercise isn't like, it's not like eating or not, exercising or not. Like we understand nutrition enough to know, hey, there's a diversity of macronutrients and micronutrients you need. So I just started talking about movement in that way to go, let's talk about movement like a diet. Are you fasting most of the day and then doing like 1 hour of moving only? Because then we needed to spread out, your movement diet throughout the day. And then do you always take the exact same form of exercise every time you move? Is like the diversity really low? Because it doesn't matter how good or bad a food is. If it's the only food that you consume, you're going to be malnourished. So just to talk about movement in those ways for people to go, oh, I understand. Like I need to better distribute my movement over the day, and I need to better distribute my movement over my body.
Awesome. So you talk about the feet. So, I've noticed, obviously, our 2 most reflexive movements are breathing and walking. And it's a massive influence on my demographic, and they don't even acknowledge the influence it has on their knees and on their pelvic stability. Can you talk about some integration of maybe some exercises, or how people may start to incorporate getting stronger feet?
Well, first you got to kick your shoes off. Like if you're listening right now, you can take your shoes off and you can check and see if you have the strength in your feet to spread your toes away from each other. So I have like a few tests. 1, can you spread your toes away from each other? 2, can you lift just your big toes by themselves? Can you lift them one at a time? Can you lift each one of your toes in a series and then put them back down again? Because if you look at your hands and you can see the complexity of movement that they can do, your feet really have that similar potential. So that's one way, is just to add some foot exercises to your exercise regime. The second thing is to pay attention to what you're putting your feet in. Mm-hmm. So there are shoes, all shoes that you put on your feet are going to affect your movement in some way, but there are shoes that are stiffer than other shoes. There are shoes with higher heels than other shoes. There are shoes that are more narrow in the front than other shoes. So if I were to give you like a quick checklist, you would want to be able to evaluate your shoes to make sure the sole is flat, the sole is flexible, the toe box where you put your toes are wide. And then this last one is not as intuitive. because you can have a flip-flop. You can put your feet into flip-flops because maybe you exercise your feet already. Maybe they're already flat and flexible. But a flip-flop, when you put it on, you actually have to tense your feet to keep it on because it doesn't have a full upper. Yep. So getting a full upper, getting something that connects the shoe to your foot without you having to tense or stiffen musculature to keep it on, those are some ways to almost immediately get more movement out of your body.
Yeah, I don't let my kids use flip-flops. I always have something with a heel because if you put on a flip-flop, you automatically start gripping the bottom of the shoe, and you get these people who have these warped toes, like, oh, that's just the way I am. I'm like, no, that's the way you've evolved. Do you have a particular brand that you like to wear? I don't know, giving people shout-outs, but is there anything that you like? Because I think this is one where people need a bit of advice.
Yeah, and definitely. So I maintain a full list of all the minimal shoe companies that I'm aware of throughout the world. At Nutritious Movement, you can go look Shoes the List. And there's Shoes the List, there's Shoes the Winter List, Shoes the Summer List, and Shoes the Kids List. So you can take yourself through all of those and figure out exactly what works for you. Because feet are really individual. We all have different gait patterns and things that we're asking of our shoes. So you can definitely weigh in looking at those examples.
Awesome. I want to stick with feet a little bit because I've watched some of your videos online, and I've seen where you've done some really unique things to your house as far as changing the environment people walk on, changing depths and heights. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. So if you look at what is beneath your feet most of the time, when you go for a walk, when you're walking into where you're going to exercise, it's almost always flat and level, right? And so we're so used to it, we don't think about it, but basically to your feet, because you wear the same shoes and walk in the same way on the same stuff, it's like going to the gym and only doing one exercise. It's like you would only do bicep curls as 100% of your arm's experience, that you would never move them in a different way. So our feet are definitely suffering repetitive use injuries, and the feet are pretty complex. You got 33 joints in each foot. You definitely have movable parts where you can control, the lifting and the spreading of the toes and the plantar flexion, the dorsiflexion of the ankle. But a lot of the joints in the foot, their job, if we're to give them a job, is to deform over the shape of something textured. They only get moved. They're body parts that are only moved passively by what you walk on. So you can never exercise those parts of your feet as long as you are only walking on flat and level. It'll never happen. The movements in those parts will never happen. So when we were designing our house, we're trying to design spaces that get us the movement that we normally would like drive to training, drive to the gym to get. It's like, how can I get this movement just by, walking around in my house? So when it came time to do the foyer, like the entryway, when you walk in from the front door, we had this space, and like most people were looking at like what tile we're going to put in, and we just decided to go for river rock. We just filled it full of rocks because that means that 6 times a day, I'm basically getting foot movement. Like my environment, my house is now moving. So I don't have to get out a fascia ball and train the fascia in my feet. I don't have to practice my balance training, on a Bosu. I can just get it. Or I can also get it just moving around in my house. So our house has a lot of tweaks like that, but the rock foyer is definitely the most interesting. And when people come in, they're like totally tripping out. Like they're not really capable. They're not capable of dealing with the sensations of their feet, including my brothers will come in and they're like marathoners, they're super endurance athletes, but they're so stiff in the knees and the hips and the feet that when they come in, they're like, it's so hard. And I was like, you guys cannot call yourself athletes right now. You have to take off your shoes and stand on this. Like you've neglected maybe the most complex part of your body that also contributes to everything else that you do with your body.
It's funny how that works, right? So,
Sure.
As an athlete, you walk on something that's unstable and you kind of freeze and you're confused and you walk really, really slowly. Whereas if you do it to kids, I'm sure you remember that when you had kids, your kids were young, the first time you put shoes on them, what they do, typically they'll stop and they're kind of confused as to what to do. Same if you put shoes on a dog, they like stand still and they're confused. They don't know what to do because they're just used to having nothing on their feet. So it's kind of how things come full circle. I think it's awesome what you're doing with feet, but people typically will manifest most of their feet problems, from my experience, in their hip and their spine. Can you talk about some of the exercises you incorporate into your training routines or into your day-to-day routine that help people improve mobility or maybe assess mobility at their hips to kind of preemptively prevent back pain?
Well, I mean, we definitely, like, the hip is so complex. I have people just assess how well they can move it. Usually bringing it up in front of them, like flexing your hip is not so much of a big deal, but everything, because you practice it the most. So I think the thing to remember about anyone is that you are adapted to what you do most frequently, not to what you do like most excitedly or where you're really paying attention. Like, you're adapting to it all. So since most people sit in a chair as their most frequented physical activity, they're really good, like their body is really good at assuming those positions. So, a stiff foot coupled with almost an entire life spent sitting in a chair creates this dynamic where the quads are often really tense, the hamstrings and the glutes are often fairly weak, and the spine has become the hinge for walking rather than the hip itself. So you'll still see a leg go in front of you and behind you. It's still swinging front to back when you walk, but instead of the socket of the hip being the fulcrum or that point of the swinging, the hinge is now migrated 3 or 4 inches north, and it's the lumbar spine that's basically doing the work of the hip now, because it's easier for your body to take your adaptations to shoes and chairs and make your lumbar spine the new hip, which means the muscles of your lower back become essentially your glutes. And then your glutes can just atrophy because they don't have to support any of your walking, and the hip doesn't have to articulate. So if you have a mirror, you can stand so that you have your side to the mirror so that you're looking at your profile. And if you put your hands on your pelvis to stabilize it, you can practice and see how much you can get your leg in front of you and behind you without moving the pelvis. And then that will give you a sense of, wow, I might only have, some people don't have any extension in their hip at all, but they're walking. And if you watch them when they walked or filmed, you would see that their leg travels significantly behind them. And then that's when you know that there's a significant, if we take 10,000 steps a day, that's 10,000 lumbar spine extensions loaded. And so I try to explain people's, if they're having issues of the lumbar spine and sometimes simultaneously pain in the hips and the knees, it's like you're not using these parts of your body as much as you think you are, because you see the leg going behind you. The tiny muscles of your spine, which have their own purpose, you've outsourced the glutes and hips work to the lumbar spine, which is a fine strategy. It's just not a way to go through 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years. It just can't sustain that.
So I think most of the people in the fitness industry, like you speak about, get so caught up in their routine. They're really good at certain things and they're really, really poor at certain things. And your book, Move Your DNA, is an amazing resource of exercises for anyone listening who wants to learn how to move better, improve their mobility, literally just live a better life. Can you talk about some maybe qualitative examples of how people know if they're actually losing more mobility? Because I would guess we have a lot of listeners that are sitting there going, well, I'm not really sure if my mobility is decreasing.
Yeah, and it becomes a pain, to like figure out how to all of a sudden be technically trained in assessing mobility. But a really great test is that sit and rise test. That predictor of all-time mortality is like if you're standing and you come down to sitting cross-legged on the floor and stand back up again, how many times do you have to make contact on the floor to facilitate that, right? So are you sitting down? Can you just, from standing, drop all the way down and lower your hips to the floor? And then you start giving yourself a point for every time you fall, every time some part of you touches down, like maybe you have to put one hand behind you to lower yourself down to the floor. Maybe you can get all the way there, but you fall like the last 8 inches. That would be a point. So you can kind of get a simple assessment of like, okay, here's where I am right now. And then you can work on some of those mobilizing exercises, or simply just have yourself get up and down from the floor like 30 times a day, which is why I recommend ditching your furniture for a month just to see what happens to your knees and your hips and your spine. Because that just puts a really specific training program in place. So you can assess yourself, give up furniture for 30 days, lower yourself to and from the floor 30 times a day, and then see how your score is at the end of the month. And then you'll have a sense of if you've become more mobile and stronger relative to that test.
Amazing. So I think a lot of my demographic is concerned with getting maximum output out of their exercise. So, not only are they trying to live this long, healthy, vibrant life, but I also want to work hard. And one of the things that I've evolved to do is, like I said, I have my own gym, so I have the luxury of training with no shoes on. And the idea of grounding my feet into the ground has really massively increased my ability to generate stability around my pelvis, my ability to generate stability around my core. Can you talk about some of your favorite exercises that help people perhaps move the needle on their output, move the needle on their performance? Maybe it's stabilizing the pelvis, maybe it's stabilizing the core. Any of your favorite exercises?
My favorite exercise, my two favorite exercises are the pelvic list. So pelvic list, they're not exercises that maybe many people are familiar with. They're really exercises that I've developed that address specifically areas that are sedentary within an otherwise active body. So if you want to increase your athletic performance and the results that you're getting from your training, one, you want to make sure that you can continue that training, right? So like longevity, not just for the sake of longevity, but being able to do what you want to do for a longer period of time. If it's training, you want to make sure that you're kind of paying attention to those movement vitamins you might need to supplement with. So the pelvic list is a really big movement supplement vitamin, and you stand on I don't have phone books anymore, but like
stand on your iPhone 10.
Exactly. You want to get like a yoga block or a couple of thick books that you have laying around. You want to have it be at least 3 inches high, and you're going to stand on it barefoot with only 1 foot on there, and you're going to make sure your leg is straight, not hyperextending, not flexed, but just vertically straight, ankle, knee, and hip. And then you're going to, if you put your hand on the top of the pelvis, the side of the pelvis that's over the legs standing on the block, you're going to push that side of the pelvis down, and you're going to use the muscles on the outside of that hip. And the result is it lifts up the other side of your hip. Yep. So that's actually, those are your abductors. But abduction, when your leg is fixed, ends up just floating the other pelvis up. This is a move that should be present in most walking that is disabled by the geometry that you adapt to with a positive heeled shoe, which means any heel on your shoe, and knee flexion or sitting in a chair. So like plantar flexion and knee flexion basically disables the lateral hips from participating when you walk from point A to point B. So even if you wanted those to work, if you have those adaptations to that geometry, those muscles don't kick in. So you're going to shift already. If you're following some of the exercises, you're going to shift to something that is flat as far as a shoe goes, and you're going to work to decrease how much time you spend sitting in a chair with your knees flexed. And then you're going to pair that with this pelvic list exercise. And the cool thing is this pelvic list not only works the lateral hip. When you tense the glute in this way, the other side of the glute from the hip is going to attach to the sacrum. So you end up creating an opposing tension on the sacrum that kind of balances out the constant tension on the pelvic floor, right? So many people are dealing with a lot of sometimes hypertension in the pelvic floor, right? And so as you can train the lateral hips and stabilize this way, it also ends up being something that affects not only your hips, not only your knees, but also your sacroiliac joint and your pelvic floor all in one, which is why I like it. It's like a super vitamin. It's like a multivitamin more like. So you do like 20 reps on each leg, and you're going to do that 3 or 4 times. And then the next step is to, once you're out walking, see if you can't invoke that same motion with every step, so that your pelvic list then gets put into how you move from point A to point B.
Do you have any? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I just had one more, and that is it's the calf stretch that I recommend, which is different than the calf stretching exercises that most people do.
Okay.
This is an exercise. You could also say it's like vitamin uphill, right? So a lot of us don't ever walk uphill. We either walk on flat or level, or we take stairs to go up, which is more flat as far as the ankle is concerned. Going uphill requires dorsiflexion with a straight leg, but stairs allow you to have no ankle dorsiflexion.
Sure.
So you take I use like a half foam roller, or you can take a towel and fold it and roll it up. So you've got, again, something that's like 4 inches tall, and you put the forefoot up on it while you leave your heel down. So you're in dorsiflexion, standing fully upright on that leg, and then you scoot your other leg forward, and then you get a sense of how your calves need to lengthen to accommodate an actual stride in progress versus the way a lot of us stretch our calves, which are not really relating back to gait. Right? Like you're not paying as much attention to what your knees are doing or the rest of your torso is doing. So it's a calf stretch. It's a vitamin uphill that you put in until you can start finding or prioritizing supplementing some of your walking or training on a ramp or some sort of element of uphill.
On a day-to-day basis, how much attention are you paying to this? Are you setting aside, 30 minutes here, 10 minutes there, or how are you incorporating it into, your day-to-day routine? So obviously your life maybe has evolved to incorporate this on a regular basis, but for an average person, there's tons of stuff they could and possibly should be doing. So how do you look at incorporating it all?
I think for exercisers who's probably, who are going to be listening, you want to set aside like 15 to 20 minutes of correctives, or you could think of them as supplements. I think corrective exercise is one way of looking at it, but you could also just look at corrective exercise invokes the idea that you have to have an injury that you're working to fix, and then once you have it, you're not doing those anymore. So it's not a therapy. It is nutrition. So you're just going, okay, these are the things that I like to do when I train, but I recognize that the thing that I like to do when I train, i.e. the thing that I like to eat the most, doesn't give me the full spectrum of nourishment to actually be well enough to come back and do that same training that I like to do in the future. So I'm going to add 15 to 20 minutes of supplements to make sure that I don't have sedentary areas within my body. Because at the end of the day, that's what's happening is you have some cells that are being moved by what you're doing, and then you have some cells that are not being moved with what you're doing. So we think of like fitness as a whole body state, but you could also say that fitness is on a cell by cell evaluation. So you could have very fit areas of your body, areas that are adapted to the benefits of movement, and then you can have areas that are couch potatoes. And so when you have couch potatoes sitting next to very strong points, mechanically, those are areas that are very susceptible for injury or disease. So you want to at least make sure to give a small shout out to some of those muscles that go neglected by what you prefer to do. So 15 to 20 minutes, you can often use how you feel as a way to identify what you need to do. So like if you wrote down at the beginning of Move Your DNA, I have this assignment, and you guys can do it without reading the book. It is write down all the areas of your body that like give you little niggling complaints, things that you're popping ibuprofen for, things that you are getting actual treatment for, like, if you have to go to the chiropractor to adjust a certain area of your body, areas that are your prone areas that have already been damaged in like accidents or through repetitive use that you always have to kind of baby or pamper, or anything that your parents had that are concerns of yours that are in your mind. You write all that down, and then you pick your correctives based on those. So if you see shoulder, neck, head, then you're going to prioritize maybe some of the sedentary areas in the upper spine, neck and shoulders. If it's like tingling in the hands or whatever, you're going to think like elbows and wrist. If it's, again, lower body. So you just kind of, you do it based on that. And then obviously my life has evolved where I've built a lot of the correctives into my day. I'm talking with you right now. I'm actually doing the calf stretch that I recommended. I'm doing it right here because, I'm tied to my computer. A lot of us are. So you get things at your feet that you could be doing right now that don't count towards those 15 to 20 minutes of using the exercises as exercise. So exercise is when you're doing it just for the sake of exercise. When I'm on my podcast and moving my feet, I'm doing two things at once. So it kind of makes it a little bit more into your life and away from your exercise program. So at the kitchen sink, at the bathroom sink where you're brushing your teeth, put 2 or 3 of those things in. You can pelvic list while you're brushing your teeth, and that would be you would feel the effects of doing it if you only did it in that way. But if you just did 15 to 20 minutes a day, I think that you would feel radically different.
One of the greatest things one of my best mentors said to me was you should be moving every one of your joints through its entire excursion, its entire possible range of motion every single day. And that's literally the life you're living. But one question I want to ask is, just getting in a little bit deeper, should this be movement-based or muscle contraction-based, which I just want to clarify the distinction, if you can make one.
Well, can you clarify the difference? I guess I'm not sure the distinction.
So should they just be focused on moving, or should it be like, hey, I'm actually actively trying to contract specific musculature?
Yeah, so it's a difference between like kinematics or kinetics, right? Like the kinematics are the idea that something has moved. Kinetics are more about how it moved.
Right.
So I think that it's both. I think that there's a benefit through going through the geometry. At the same time, there is a benefit to facilitating the change in the geometry. So, there's a difference cell-wise. So in Move Your DNA, I break it down in terms of loads. The load is completely different. If you put a sling on your arm that holds it at 90 degrees, you could, or even if you had a contraption that flexed and extended my arm passively, I would receive the benefit of that joint of motion. But there are adaptations to movement, and the adaptations of movement are just barely being understood. Like there are cellular adaptations, epigenetic changes within the muscle that's producing the force. So then we start to look at force production with the movement as a completely separate variable. So I think that you can approach it in either way, with the caveat of eventually you'll need to do it both ways. However, if you do it with the muscular force, where you are actually moving it versus a machine, if you think of a machine that moves you passively, that you are killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right? Like you're getting the joint motion and you're getting the muscle production to facilitate it. So I always work on everything of like, well, what's the evolutionary basis for it? I try to look at, well, what are the motions that are happening? Obviously, like I said, the motions in your foot, the fact that those joints are being deformed, there is actually not a lot of facilitated movement of the actual feet. Like there's not an exercise replica of getting that motion. Those joints deform passively, right? And so in that case, the only way to move those is by moving my whole body, using my muscle to a space that then passively moves my feet. So it's likely going to be a hybrid.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you. So obviously this thought process for you came from an attempt to kind of return to our roots, return to maybe what human beings were meant to do evolutionarily. Tell me a little bit about how you incorporate this, or incorporate additional measures of reconnecting with nature, reconnecting to our roots.
Well, and I think that my original pursuance wasn't to pursue like an evolutionary supported life. It was more that like I'm an exercise scientist. Like what I do is I'm trying to break down what movement is. It's just that in order to do that, you have to look outside of the culture that you are in. So you look at cross-cultural data, and in this case, the cross-cultural data includes hunter-gatherers who live and look at their disease markers. So I think it was that is my pursuance. It is still I'm still very Diane Fossey over here. It's just that my apes are my movement, and it became my family's movement, right? Because so much of this stuff, then you realize, oh, my joint capacity isn't really only limited to how I move the last 10 years. It's how I moved the first 5 years. It was how I moved the first 1 year, that I was put into an environment that actually decreased my capacity for movement going forward. And so then if someone is going to study movement rigorously, we have to go, okay, well, we have so many therapies, very expensive therapies and technologies needed to overcome movement capacities that were set by a sedentary culture early on. Like, these are the things that we need to call out. It's the same thing like in nutrition. Like, you've got vitamins and minerals and complex food bars and creating new food sources to get these things. It's like, well, what was their original source? Are those original sources still feasible? So it's just looking at like that. But at the same time, the more I recognize the complexity of movement and the diversity of movement that it would take to do what your mentor suggested, move all parts of you, I realized I can't actually move all these parts inside, meaning I will never be able to move, let's say my erector pili, which is all the individual muscles that lift up your hair follicles, right? So you've got more muscles than the ones that are listed on your training manuals. You've got trillions of muscle, millions anyway. And to recognize, okay, well, I've been doing all of this with my upper body. You know, I can pull myself up, I can chin up myself, I can go across the monkey bars, I can hang and hold my 180-pound husband on my back as I hang. I can do all of that. My kids can hang on to me as I go across the bars, but my weak spot continued to be my skin. And then I was realizing, like, oh, the shape that my skin is experiencing is being reduced to the bar, right? The smooth surface of the bar that I always hold on to work my arms, that was limiting the diversity of movement. So my skin could never get strong enough for me to take the next step. You know, I could add gloves or other exoskeleton technologies to allow me to move forward. But I realized if you go out to a tree, everybody, and you go hang from it for a minute or probably even 20 seconds, and then come down and look at your hands, you will see that that tree has bit into your hands. The bark has pressed in, and those are movements. Those are cellular movements that you're missing. So my journey into nature is still after my longing for excellent physical training. You know, at a certain point, I just realized the diversity, the randomness that we need to cultivate to work all parts of us isn't going to happen in a hyper-controlled kind of lab. You know, like if you were to look at a study that was done in vivo versus, you know, if you're looking at a petri dish, so much of the movements that we do, they're very sterile, right? Like you're holding a straight bar with straight weights that are even on the right and left side, because why would you ever what would happen if you loaded your bar with unequal weight? Like, what would you have to do? Imagine what you would have to do to balance that out. It would call in more movement. This could actually be the way of the future right now, is everyone start doing stuff with uneven bars, and for symmetry you can make sure you do it on both, but you end up pulling in muscles that would not have participated in holding that bar when you let the weights balance. As soon as you add something heavier on one side, there's torque, which means now you're using your shoulders unevenly, which means now you're using your trunk unevenly. So we've got this idea that symmetry is in a minute to minute, not in something that averages out over time. When you go into nature, nothing is uniform. Things aren't unmoving. They're unwieldy. They're slippery. You end up using so much more and so much more of you. So like the diversity of training that's available outside is just ridiculous compared to what's inside. It's exciting for a movement geek, you know?
Yeah, you know, I load different weights in the bar all the time just by mistake. So I'm doing something right.
The adding is the problem.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously, if people want to start transitioning to using more of this stuff in their life, you know, I've noticed you don't use chairs, and like if the average person transitioned from where they are now, which is probably sedentary and probably relatively immobile, into doing these things, they sit on the floor, their posture is going to be terrible. They may actually start seeing some negative effects. Would you recommend they just dive into it and, you know, hey, let's fix it as we go, or is there a recommended progression built in?
Yeah, progression, you know, it's just like everything. You know, you're going to pursue sitting on the floor in the same way you pursue running a 10K or a half marathon, 10%, looking at your form and going, well, my form sucks, which is another way of saying I'm not strong enough to do this. I'm not strong enough to hold my parts. where they are. So then you have to bolster anything that you do. So there's ways that you can progress. Usually you remove your support system at a more gradual way. So like, let's say that you have a lazy boy that you've had for the last 15 years and you're going to like sit on the floor. Think of like 5 steps in between. Maybe take an ottoman, slide it where your lazy boy was, and sit on that for a week or 2. And you can certainly hop on the floor to feel like what it feels like and then be like, oh, I'm not ready for that. But then you can just take a bunch of pillows and you put them underneath you until you find the point that you're not forced into so much flexion, of the spine. And so you find that maybe you don't need the full height of a lazy boy, but you can settle for something in between. So use bolsters liberally. Same thing with shoes. I wrote 2 books on transitioning to minimal footwear because I think that you are so dependent on your shoes that it's just like taking feet out of a cast. Like you're not going to go take a run or do a workout without that support. So you look at, okay, well, I can maybe just add a few minutes. You have to adjust your form of how you walk. So maybe you've been walking in a real heavy-footed way where the weight is just constantly banging on the forefoot. Maybe you have a fracture there or in progress or a Morton's neuroma. Before you even transition shoes, you're going to transition form so that you strengthen the rear part of your foot so that you're not overloading the front of your foot, so that when you take out your cushion for your training, when you take off that shoe, it doesn't become more of a liability than a benefit. So yeah, progression for anything. It seems mundane. Sitting on the ground seems mundane. Walking around without a shoe versus a shoe seems mundane until you try it. That what you're feeling is just the capacity you have for change. It's your training program in that space. And so pursue it as such.
One of the things that I read that you quoted was work for food. Tell me about that and what that actually means.
Well, so, it's maybe something, if you're in the urban setting and you're not used to growing your own food, harvesting, if you haven't hunted before, if you haven't done the work to, plant and dig and harvest, if you've never picked a bunch of apples, like food is, if we're going to go back to that natural, that evolutionary perspective, food is the reason we move. Hunger is the impetus for movement for humans, for all animals, really for all life. Mm-hmm. You have to get that input. We are fortunate enough to have outsourced most of our food labor to other people and other technologies. So we're missing that movement. So over time, as I'm trying to get that training, it's not only the diversity of movement that I'm looking for. It's really hard to manufacture willpower all of the time, right? To muster to train for most people is hard enough. Like that's why most people don't exercise at all. It's because to overcome our innate tendencies to conserve energy, you're fighting that all of the time. Fighting all of the time to get yourself to the gym that day, fighting all of your time to get out of your chair for a stretching break. There was so much fighting against nature that I changed my house so I didn't have to fight against nature. I want to plop down on a chair just like every other human. Guess what? I don't have any. Down to the floor I go, right? So it's like necessity. My body is shaped by necessity. So the second piece was okay, well, then can I shape my kitchen in a way that requires more movement? So now we instead of buying ground coffee or using an electric grinder, we have a hand grinder. So it's not very much, but it's...
Oh, no, it is, because I've done it, and I refuse to do it ever again.
It is. It's 4 minutes and it's only 4 minutes. But then I was did you see that research that just came out on European women 5,000 years ago where they scanned their bones and compared them to modern athletes and found that these women, because of the pounding and the movement of the food to get it to eat, you go down, you buy flour already done, huge work has been done to get that, and humans used to do all of that. We're shaped, our genetics are shaped by that history of moving for our food, so therefore moving for your food is in your genes. And so just small changes, buying whole nuts instead of chopped nuts, instead of buying nut butters. And if you have kids and you're like, how can I get my kids to move more? You get a bunch of nuts. And also, how do I get my elderly parents to move? Like, I will take out bags of nuts, and my mother, my kids' grandparents, and my kids will sit there and just smash and bang rocks into the nuts and separate them. And so now, like, it's easier to eat more nutritiously, environmentally. I like everything. Like, we buy a lot of whole unprocessed foods and do some of the labor ourselves, as well as we're working towards, more hunting and more gathering. Where we live, crabs and salmon and deer and elk are fairly abundant. So it's the capacity, we can row our canoe out, drop a crab pot and pull it back up. Not everybody has that, but you might have an apple farm nearby where you can go, take the family out. You have blueberries in the summertime. Like, think of it not just as a fun summertime activity, but as a movement opportunity to be like, we're going to go harvest, and then we'll dehydrate. And for the year, we'll be able to work off our, apple rings or whatever. But it will be movement that you're pursuing, as well as just, like a whimsical summer activity or whatever. So stuff like that. That's what Move for Food is just to recognize that the labor that we're missing is because we stopped moving for our food.
Awesome. I'm the type of guy who tells all my friends, if I ever disappear, I'm probably going to be living in a jungle in a hut somewhere that I made by myself. As far as incorporating this stuff into my house, what are the changes that I need to make immediately from your perspective that would allow me to live a more mobile, movement-enriched life?
You certainly don't have to ditch your furniture, but use it less, use it differently, create hey, if we're going to watch Netflix, it's got to be on the floor, because you won't just sit there. Your discomfort will be a natural stimulus of stretching and all the things that you don't really want to do because you want to do something else. As soon as you're there watching the show and you've said, I'm going to use the floor instead of the couch, you're going to start moving more than just being on the floor and getting up and down from the floor brings. So use your furniture less. Like you said, you can take a tour of my house to see a whole bunch of different ideas. Rearrange your kitchen cupboard so that everything in your life has been arranged for convenience. And what you might not have recognized is that convenience simply means less movement. It does not mean less time, because your need for movement exists even after you saved the movement. So all you did by doing convenient things is made it so that you got no movement at the end of the day. So now you have to figure out where to get 3 to 6 hours of movement. You didn't save time. Right? Yeah, you didn't save time. So we put all of our plates and the stuff that we use, like for eating, our dishes, down low, so that you'll get 12 squats, unloading the dishwasher, setting the table, putting the dishes back, right? So I'm bending and moving, as opposed to like keeping my body totally straight and using barely any movement of my arms, because everything was chosen to be put in a place that I didn't have to move for. The things that you use every day, put them up really high, like so high. My husband puts up things so high that I have to like haul up like a seal onto the counter to reach it. And I kind of bitched about it a few times, and he's like, hey, like, you just got 3 like power moves because the peanut butter is up above your head. And then I was like, oh, thank you very much, right? So you just start to recognize our own resistance to, like, I would be perfectly happy going to a bar to practice 6 hop-ups, but I'm pissed if you do it when I'm trying to make breakfast, because that's not exercise. So shattering that boundary a little bit to go, I'm doing the thing. He did it, so I got to do the thing. Pillows, pillows are like a cast. Pillows are like another shoe. Like, someone just gave it to you as a kid. Your neck and shoulder depended on the stillness and got comfortable there, so that when you moved it, the movement was an agitation. So slowly transition to, I spent so much time in therapy trying to deal with a headache and neck and shoulder issue. And then I was like, hey, these stretches that I'm doing, like, where would those fit in an evolutionary context, in a human history context? And like, it's just your ear to your shoulder. And it's like, oh, if I didn't have this giant fluffy pillow, the neck stretches that I'm trying to do, those movements would just happen in the night. And so it took me a year. So don't ditch your pillow. You're going to transition. I say, if you have a cheap pillow, put a hole in it. And you can just remove stuffing over time so that it becomes kind of an endlessly adjustable bolster, or grab a sweatshirt or something and fold that to a height that's comfortable and reduce it just by 10%, something small, so that you're only getting a little bit of movement. And over 6 months, you are no longer dependent. Like, our whole family can sleep just fine, no pillows, on a hard floor. And our body has adapted to the pressures and the mobilities necessary to do that. So if your back hurts when you're camping, it's because you're overly dependent on the immobility that your bed creates. So it's just about more movement through the night. Now we're playing with like the movement in our sleep, on the cellular level.
Right. Awesome. So if my demographic wants to find you, where should they go? Should they buy your book? Should they go to your website? Should they go to your YouTube? What's the first place you want everybody to find you?
Ooh, my website is nutritiousmovement.com, but warning, it's totally overwhelming because it's 10 years worth of blog posts. There's 10 books. There's 40 videos, exercise videos. You can go on YouTube and you can see some basic explanations. I have a podcast with 100 episodes. So I think that the listener probably needs to figure out the way that they best work. If you like visuals, my Instagram is a great way to see what a movement-rich life looks like. You can see all of the solutions. Again, there's 1,000 posts there, though. Read Move Your DNA. Like, if you just instantly wanted to be like, I want to learn more, read Move Your DNA, or better yet, get the Move Your DNA audiobook so that you can walk and listen to it. And you can still download the exercise PDF so that you can have visuals for the exercise. But almost all my books are available on Audible too, so that you can get moving while you're learning about why you need to move more.
Awesome, Katy. You got a fan in me, and I'm very grateful for your time and your knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben.
Have a great day.
You too.